like to welcome everybody this evening to this special edition of the Armchair Travel Series. For those who have watched our previous talks, you'll probably recognise me, but for those who this is their first time, I'm Claire Baxter, one of the Alumni Engagement Coordinators here at Cambridge. This evening, I'd like to welcome three guests. Firstly, Ed Payne from Last Frontiers, who many of you may have met in person at one of our alumni festivals on the Sidgwick site. Alice Burns from Temple World, again, who you may have seen on our alumni festivals. And I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Nick Davies, Cambridge alumnus and Professor of Behavioural Ecology at the Department of Zoology. I'd now like to hand it over to Ed.
Thank you, Claire, for that kind introduction. I'll keep it brief because I know you're waiting for the main event. My name's Ed Payne. I work for Last Frontiers. We're one of the small select band of tour operators who operate tours for the Cambridge Alumni Programme. And I just thought before we started, I'd mention two tours in particular, because of course, Nick Davies is leading them. And the first one is in March next year, and it's going to Costa Rica. It's operated by Temple World, which is Alice's company, who's also on this call. And that looks a wonderful trip. Any details you'll get in the follow-up email from Claire. And then in May, Nick is going with us to Peru on a Wildlife of Peru trip, which will be this curious naturalist's first visit to Peru, which we're very excited about. It's finishing with 5 days deep in the Amazon in the Tambopata Research Centre. That's all I'm going to say on that, because as I say, Claire, I know you're going to send further details in your email. So Nick, who many of you will know, is, as Claire said, Professor of Behavioural Ecology at the Department of Zoology, and he's a Fellow of Pembroke. He's a really engaging speaker. He spoke to us last year, at the end of last year, and I'm still coming up with questions about that talk. If there are any questions during his presentation, do put them in the chat, and I'm happy to put them to Nick at the end. On the other hand, if you just want to sit back and listen, then that's fine too. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Nick will share his.
Right, thank you. I'll just press a few buttons. Here we go. One more. Good. And just minimize myself a bit. Good. Well, once again, a very warm welcome to everybody on behalf of Ed and Alice and Claire Baxter at the Alumni Office. For the next 35 minutes or so, we're going to have a trip out to the tropics, to the Neotropics in particular. And I've selected some of the sites which have thrilled me most during recent alumni trips and other trips. So just to get us in the mood, here we are in the Neotropics, some of the star animals. There's a jaguar, I hope you can see on the right here. Above it, there's a scarlet macaw. We've got anaconda snakes, largest snakes in the world. We've got a spider monkey leaping across the middle of the screen. There's a howler monkey here, and you'll have to be careful because this huge harpy eagle preys on monkeys. It's one of the fiercest predators in the world. We're not just going to watch, we're going to wander too. And the two guides who are going to help us wander are these two big beards. You can think of me as a little beard guiding this tour, but the big beards are Charles Darwin on the left and Alfred Russel Wallace on the right. And really their travels in the tropics inspired them to come up with some wonderful evolutionary ideas, which really changed the way we now see the natural world. And their theories still inspire curious naturalists today. Now here is two destinations next year, as Ed mentioned, Costa Rica in the top and Peru down here. And just to show you some of the amazing diversity in these two areas, there are something like 10,000 bird species in the world. Costa Rica has an incredible 918 species seen. That's almost 1 in 10 of all the birds in the world. Peru has got twice as many. It's a bigger country with a more variety of habitats. And down here near Cusco in Manu National Park, it has the world record for the number of species seen in a day, an incredible 331. So in a 12-hour tropical day, that's a new species every 2 minutes or so. You'd hardly have time to write them in your notebook. Now, before we celebrate this wonderful diversity, we're just going to pop out to the Galapagos, because it was a visit here a couple of 100 years ago which really started off our evolutionary wandering. Excuse me. And we're going to follow the young Charles Darwin, who came to Cambridge as an undergraduate about 200 years ago, 1828, and he was a student at Christ College. You can see the streets were a little bit quieter in those days. By Charles's own admissions, he was not a star student. He wrote, "My time was wasted as far as academical studies were concerned. I gained a good place among the oi polloi, not for honours." And he spent a lot of his time collecting beetles. And do come and see this wonderful beetle collection, which we've got exhibited in the Zoology Museum next time you're in Cambridge. But he must have impressed his teachers, particularly John Stevens Henslow on the left. And it was through his good offices that Darwin was offered the post of naturalist on the voyage of the Beagle, which was to be captained by Robert Fitzroy, who was then only 26 years of age, just 4 years older than the young Darwin. Darwin was training to become a clergyman, and at first his father was a bit worried about him swanning off on the Beagle, but he was persuaded that actually the pursuit of natural history was very good for a young clergyman, so he allowed Charles to go. And the Beagle set sail from Plymouth just after Christmas in 1831. Well, Darwin soon discovered that he was not a very good sailor. He wrote in his diary, "I loathe the sea." But the voyage, which was to take 5 years, wasn't at sea all the time. In fact, Darwin spent a lot of the time on the South American mainland collecting specimens. And they'd already been away for 4 years when the Beagle arrived in the Galapagos, 15th of September, 1835. And while Fitzroy and the rest of the crew charged round mapping the islands, Darwin got off on various islands, and as was his habit throughout the trip, he collected specimens. And he noticed these little birds quietly hopping about. They were not frightened by stones being thrown at them. Mr. King killed one with his hat. And here they are. And again, we've got these on display in our Zoology Museum in Cambridge, alongside Darwin's beetles. And Darwin thought this one at the top must be an oriole because it's got rather a long beak. These ones on the right he thought were true finches. They've got big, thick beaks. And this little one on the right, bottom right, he thought was probably a wren or a warbler because of its thin beak. And it even flicked its wings to disturb insects, just like a warbler does. Well, Darwin returned to the UK, and he spent his first year back in Cambridge, in Fitzwilliam Street. There's this nice plaque to commemorate him staying there for a year. But he wrote, "The only evil I found in Cambridge was it being far too pleasant." It's a warning for us all perhaps there. And he went to London simply to be closer to the experts who were identifying his specimens. And the little birds were sent to John Gould, who was the ornithology expert. And after looking at these specimens, Gould announced to Darwin's astonishment that they were actually all finches, even this little one here with a thin beak here, which Darwin had thought was a wren. Now, Gould, the expert, brilliant on all the little details, missed the big picture. And it was Darwin himself who saw the big story behind these observations. And in a famous paragraph in The Voyage of the Beagle, he wrote, "Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." And Darwin started musing with these branching diagrams, thinking about evolutionary change. So Darwin's idea was that perhaps a little flock of finches were blown out to sea 600 miles across the Pacific. They arrived in these newly emerged volcanic islands. There were no other birds there, and so they had a free habitat in which to exploit all the resources without any competition. And he imagined that over time, this finch flock diversified to fill all the niches which other species would have filled on the mainland. Well, we now know Darwin's conjecture is correct. Back in 1999, just 20 years ago, for the very first time, we had evidence from molecular genetics that all these 16 species of finches do indeed belong to one family. And the estimate is that they colonized the islands something like 2.5 billion years ago. And you can see that at the top here, we've got a little group of finches which feed on the ground with small beaks up to big beaks, feeding on different sized seeds. We've got a little group here which feed up in the trees. This one at the top behaves rather like a tit. This one down the bottom here, a vegetarian finch, behaves more like a parrot. And here are the little warblers down here, which Darwin thought were wrens. They're warbler finches. They've evolved from finch ancestry. And just as Darwin predicted, their closest living relative is a little finch that lives on mainland Ecuador. Now, this will, of course, have evolved too in the last 2.5 million years, but we can imagine perhaps a little flock of finches roughly like this being lost out to sea and encountering this fresh habitat and evolving to exploit all these various niches. Now, these finch studies are still carrying on today, and they're still inspiring biologists. And I want to talk just for a few minutes about some wonderful work done by friends of mine, Peter and Rosemary Grant, who are now at Princeton University. And Peter was a Cambridge alumnus. He did genetics in the 1960s here in Cambridge. And they, as a husband and wife team, have studied the medium ground finch, one of those species, on Daphne major since 1975, and they've studied a total of over 30,000 individuals, all who've been caught and coloringed and individually measured, and their lives and reproductive success have been followed. You might think, gosh, what a wonderful life to be swanning around in the Galapagos for 30 to 40 years. Well, actually, it's quite tough. It's very hot, there's no shade, and there's no fresh water either. And these volcanic rocks are very sharp. So it's really been a heroic effort by Peter and Rosemary to continue this study through very tough conditions. Now, in The Origin of Species, Darwin, musing about evolutionary change, had imagined that natural selection's daily and hourly scrutinizing the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, and preserving and adding up all those that are good. And then he wrote, of course, we see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages. Well, for once, Darwin is wrong. And Peter here has been measuring finches together with Rosemary, and they've shown that evolutionary change can occur very fast, often within a year or two. And I just want to show you one example from their studies. Medium ground finches vary in beak size quite a lot between individuals. So this one on the bottom's got quite a small beak, and this individual, it's the same species, has got a bigger beak. And these small differences have got very profound consequences for the kinds of food which the finches can eat. This lower finch is very good at eating small seeds. This bigger finch up here can eat very hard seeds, for example, those of Tribulus. What it does is it peels off the cap of this capsule and then pecks out each of these seeds one by one. Small-beaked individuals don't bother, they couldn't do this. Well, at the start of the study, back in March 1976, the vegetation was very lush, and there was a total of 1,200 of these birds on the island, all measured and studied by the Grants. And then in March 1977, there was a terrible drought, and 85% of the population died. We were left with just 180 birds. And because the Grants had measured everybody, they knew which ones had survived and which ones died. And the results were very interesting. Along the top graph here, we've got the sizes of beaks across the population. And the white histograms show the distribution of the 1976 parents. But then as a result of the drought, the survivors are now shown in shaded, and you can see that on average, it was the big individuals that are more likely to survive. This is survival of the fittest, and it's natural selection in action. During the drought, all the small seeds got eaten up, and it was the big ones, big seeds that remained, and it was only the big-beaked individuals that could survive on this food. If you now look at the distribution of beak sizes a couple of years later, it's shifted to the right. And the reason is simply that these big-beaked survivors had offspring which inherited their parents' big beaks, and so as a result, beak size in the population increased, just by 1 millimeter or so, but that is evolution in action just over a few years as a result of natural selection. Well, the grants measured beaks in these finches for 30 plus years, and this graph here along the bottom shows beaks going down and up depending on the drought and the availability of small and big seeds. And you might think after 30 years or so, surely they should have gone off and done something else. But they carried on, and it was a good job they did, because in 2003, there was a natural experiment in the sense that a flock of large ground finches, a different species, arrived on the island. And they are exceptionally good at eating these hard tribulus seeds. They don't muck about just by peeling capsules. They just put the whole thing in their beak and crunch it up, and that's the whole lot of seeds gone. And they soon outcompeted these larger beaked individuals of the medium ground finch. And as a result, under competition, it was the smaller beaked ones which survived better. So you can see that the average beak size of the medium ground finch now became very much smaller as a result of competition. And these observations of the grant showing adaptation in relation to varying foods available and the effects of competition have now alerted people to seeing evolution even in our back gardens on the mainland. A lovely example has been reported recently of great tits in suburban habitats evolving longer beaks so as to be better able to access seeds in the feeders that we put out during the winter. Natural selection and evolutionary change in action. And Darwin's genius was to see that this evolution in this little family of finches is a model in miniature for the evolution of all life on Earth over 3.5 billion years or so. Surely if an alien arrived on our planet and said, if we could understand them, what's life like on your planet? One of the first things we'd want to tell them is that all life on Earth is part of one evolved family tree. I don't think there's anything more thrilling that you could learn. So here at the top, we've got Darwin to represent our own species, and here's our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. If we just focus on this little bit of the family tree, Richard Dawkins has dramatized this, imagining a hands across Africa. Our last common ancestor with chimps lived around about 5 million years ago. And if we imagine a generation being 20 years, just for simplicity, that's something like 250,000 generations. Now imagine, said Richard, you're standing on the coast of Africa, holding hands with your mum, and she holds hands with her mum, and so on, forming a chain of individuals going inland from the coast. And next to you is a chimpanzee holding hands with its mother, forming a chain of mother ancestors inland too. If we imagine just 1 meter for each handhold, then our two chains would meet after just 250 kilometers. That's a very moving illustration of evolutionary change. Well, let's pop back to the tropics now and celebrate the fantastic diversity that we can see in South and Central America. The bird diversity is just stunning. Here are the hummingbirds, for example, no fewer than 379 species of hummingbirds. One of my most memorable occasions in the cloud forest of Ecuador was of a hummingbird coming and hovering just in front of my face and then gently probing up each nostril before it shot off, disappointed. And I could feel its little tongue piercing up my nostril. Luckily, it wasn't a sword-billed hummingbird, this one on the bottom left, whose beak is even longer than its body. It was just one of these little jobs up here, top left. This is the snowcap on the top right from Costa Rica, one of my favorite hummingbirds. And here in Peru, we've got an extraordinary male marvelous spatule tail, and marvelous indeed it is, with these spatules on the end of these long wired extensions to its tail with which it displays to attract mates. And then this colourful world of birds, just mind-blowing, especially on your very first visit. So here we've got toucans feeding on fruits. We've got trogons and motmots, which are sit and wait predators pouncing down on big insects and lizards in the undergrowth. And then we've got tanagers of every colour that you could possibly imagine, sometimes up to 30 different species in a flock, so that you're still identifying the species with great excitement before the flock disappears and is now out of sight. But my favourites are these little brown jobs, the ovenbirds, no fewer than 350 species, all evolved from the same ancestor with beaks and body sizes which vary from tiny little ones on the bottom left here, up to great big woodpecker-like ones with great scythe-like beaks for piercing insects from the bark. And some of these ovenbirds follow an army ants through the forest. And this is one of the most wonderful sights, I think, in the Neotropics. You can often tell when there's a swarm of army ants coming because you hear the undergrowth rustling. And what it is little insects leaping away in panic to try and avoid columns of tens of thousands of these worker army ants. And if they come across a prey, as they have here, this scorpion, they rip it to shreds, they pull it apart, and then they take the little pieces to the nest, and the nest is a bivouac in this drawing under a fallen log at the back of the picture. And this is just a temporary nest site, and it consists of the queen inside with her brood, the eggs and the larvae and the pupae, and a living wall of workers surrounding her like a chainmail fence. And following the army ants through the forest is this little antbird on the left here, and this wood creeper up on the right here on this trunk. And they're not eating the army ants themselves, they're eating the insects scattered in fright by these army ant columns as they come through the forest. Here on the left, there's a soldier defending the prey and the rest of the swarm against other enemies. After a week searching a particular area of the forest, the army ants pick up their nest, this living nest, and they all march off to another area of the forest, pitch camp again, and off they set to search a new area. Well, army ants aren't the only amazing ants living in the Neotropics. This is my favourite, I think, the leafcutter ants. It's thrilling to come across this little trail of leaves on the move through the forest. And if you follow this, perhaps for 50 metres or so, you'll see that these leafcutter ants are taking these leaves to a permanent nest. And if you crouch down and watch, you'll see that sometimes there's a little miner worker riding on board on top of the leaf. Now, I first imagined that perhaps this worker here who's carrying a leaf can't quite see where she's going, and so you need an outboard writer to say left a bit, right a bit, straight on, or whatever, so to make sure she doesn't bump into the rest of the crew. But actually, she can quite happily find her way, even with her mouth full of leaves. This little miner worker's got a different job, and that is to chase off any parasitic flies who want to come and lay their eggs on this worker down here. And those eggs would eventually hatch into larvae, and the larvae would devour this worker while it was still alive, eat the worker alive. So its job is to chase off parasitic flies to help the worker while its mouth is full and it's otherwise engaged. And then just you stand up for a bit, having been thrilled by these ants, and a morpho butterfly flies past, this fantastic glittering blue butterfly as big as the palm of your hand. And when they land, they seem to disappear. And that's because the underwing is brown and it has these large eye spots here, which deter predators. And then you see a little bundle of fur up in the canopy, and you wonder what on earth this is, and a little face peeps out, and it's a sloth. Absolutely beautiful. What's the best way to watch sloths? It's rather difficult. This is Quentin Blake's recommendation down at the bottom here. I really love this. Here's a mum hanging upside down with a little infant here. Spanish name is Los Perezosos, the lazy ones. But that's a little bit unfair. They're not lazy, they just have beautifully adapted to a nice slow life, eating poor quality food. This is a very unfair naturalist, Comte de Buffon, in the 1700s. He wrote, "The inertia of this animal is not so much due to laziness as to wretchedness. It's the consequence of its faulty structure, inactivity and stupidity. One more defect and they could not have existed." That's very unfair. These slow animals are beautifully adapted to life in the slow lane. They eat very poor quality food, and their low metabolism is a beautiful adaptation. And in fact, it takes several weeks for the food to pass through the gut. Once a week, the sloth slowly descends down the tree, and it's a thrill to watch this, and it defecates in the earth, sometimes digging a little shallow crevice. And while it does so, there's a moth which specializes living on the fur of the sloth, and it hops off and lays its eggs in the dung. And it's the larvae would develop in the dung, and the adult moths which emerge would later fly up the trees to search new sloths on which to live their lives. In fact, sloths are pretty slow, so they might even find the same sloth as their mother lives on. Well, that's not the only mammal living in the canopy. There are howler monkeys. This is our wake-up call in the early morning. They sound like lions, really, really loud. And here's my mammals of Costa Rica. Males solicit sex with a Mick Jagger-like tongue-flicking display. If the female is impressed, mating quickly ensues and lasts for an average about 30 seconds. Now, this trait here, these large vocal sacs and loud roars, are an example of mating displays. And Darwin was fascinated by these, and he came up with his theory of sexual selection to explain why males in particular evolved loud roars and big bodies and antlers, for example, in order to compete better for mates. But Darwin only got half the story. We now know that many females mate with several males, and as a result, competition continues after mating as rival sperm compete for fertilizations. So this is known as sperm competition, which is also part of sexual selection. And the howler monkeys provide a lovely example of this. There are various species of howler monkeys. Those with the loudest calls are males of a species which live with just one male and a harem of females. And they've done all the hard work early on, keeping rivals at bay, so they don't have to mate very frequently. They're guaranteed paternity with their harem because there are no other males around. Other males live in multi-male groups where there are several males coexisting and defending jointly a harem. And these males, this guy looks a bit glum on the right, have not quite so loud calls, but they have very large testes, very large balls. And this enables them to compete by mating very frequently to increase their chances of paternity in the sperm lottery with rival males. Now, our closest living relatives provide a lovely example of sperm competition in action. Here, gorillas on the right here, they live in single male groups. You can see this rather smug expression of this gorilla on the right. He knows that there are no other males about. He's guaranteed paternity, so he doesn't need to mate very often to guarantee his fatherhood of all the offspring born in his troop. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, live in multi-male groups, and they're a bag of nerves, worrying about paternity. You can see all these males lining up. They seem to be doing a Morris dance, but in fact, their camaraderie is really very mixed because there's lots of competition for matings. And here's a male examining a female, wondering whether she's ready to mate. And females during their fertile period will mate with up to 30 different males in the troop. And this is a photograph you'll never forget. This is the brain of a chimpanzee on the top here from an autopsy, and this is one testis. Chimpanzees have got enormous testes to fuel their success in the sperm lottery. And my friend Sandy Harcourt has done a comparative analysis of testis size. This is the weight of both testes shown up the y-axis of this graph here against body weight across different primate species, from tiny little marmosets on the left, squirrel-like monkeys, right up to the big apes on the right. And you can see that those that live in multi-male groups, the ones with solid symbols, have much bigger testes than you'd expect. Those who have a sole command of either one or more females are shown in the open symbols, and they don't need such big testes. They guarantee paternity, and so they tend to fall below the line. These are huge differences here because this is a log scale, so we're going up in multiples of 10. So chimpanzees, for example, are a third the weight of a gorilla, and yet they've got testes 4 times as big. Well, Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man, man with all his exalted powers still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. So where, you might wonder, do humans fit in this graph of testis size against body weight? Well, as you might expect, we're just an average primate. This point here represents our own species. Thank goodness we're not as worried as chimps about our paternity. We've got more or less the testis size you'd expect from our body size. Well, while a lot of mammals are competing for mates by force, by big body size in males, by roaring and by antlers and so on, by being tough, birds tend to compete for females by charm, by being more charming than their rivals. And here are 2 of my favorite examples. On the left, we've got the resplendent quetzal, surely one of the most extraordinary birds that you can see in Costa Rica. It's a species of trogon. It's got this long tail. It's actually not the tail, it's the tail coverts. This is the true tail in white. And as it flies through a canopy, it looks like a serpent. It's sometimes called a serpent bird. It's got this glittering iridescent green plumage. And then this red was astonishing, its pigment. And some myths say that this red belly was acquired during the wars when the Europeans were taking over, and the Mayan dead were lying on the battlefield, and the quetzals dipped their breasts in the blood of the warriors. On the right here, we've got a tufted coquette, a male hummingbird, again competing by charm for mates. Well, enter our second guide, one of my big heroes, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was fascinated by animal displays and animal colours. And here he is in New Guinea, examining a specimen of a bird of paradise. Wallace was a better sailor than Darwin. He wrote in the Malay archipelago, this is about his little journey in this little prow, which he crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean in this tiny little boat. And he wrote, "A little thatched house on deck I had all to myself, about 4 feet high, the snuggest and most comfortable little place I ever enjoyed at sea." And he journeyed all around Indonesia. We're going to join him here on the west coast of New Guinea, where he was collecting birds of paradise. And here he is at a greater paradise lek, where all the males are getting together to display in order to attract females, individuals trying to be more charming than their rivals in the hope that females will choose them. And Wallace wrote, "The adults frequent the very loftiest trees. They're shy and wary and so strong and tenacious of life. I know of no bird of its size so difficult to kill. I believe I'm the only Englishman who has ever shot and skinned and ate a bird of paradise." Well, 20 years ago, Tim Lamon, a biologist from America, came to this exact site to try and get good photographs of the birds of paradise in display. And he was just about to put up his own hides in the trees. And the native said, oh, no, 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 you can't do that. The birds won't come unless you build the hides exactly the same as we've done for dozens of generations. So they insisted on building the hides right down to the exact number of poles and the exact way of tying the poles together with twine. And they said, now the birds will come, but there's one more thing you must do before you climb up into the hide in the morning. You must put your finger in your ear and put a little bit of earwax on the trunk of the tree. Otherwise, the birds won't come. Well, Tim did exactly as he was told, and he came back to the camp next morning beaming with pleasure. And the native said, did you put your earwax on the tree? And he said, yes. And they said, I bet you got good pictures then. And he said, yes. And they said, we told you it would work. And here's one of Tim's extraordinary pictures of two male greater birds of paradise displaying to a female. And I've been lucky enough to see this myself in New Guinea, and I burst into tears the first time I saw it. It's just the most overwhelmingly wonderful sight. With these birds arriving, they just seem like meteors coming out of the sky and displaying in the forest. Well, what's going on here? Well, Darwin said this is just an example of sexual selection, and it's a case of female choice for beauty. We love beautiful things. We're animals, so why shouldn't other animals like beautiful things too? And Darwin left the explanation at that. Wallace said, no, there's got to be some reason for why females are choosing beauty. Surely these displays signal male health and vigor. And we now know that Wallace's suggestion is right. By choosing vigorously displaying males, females are getting good genetic quality for their offspring. They're shopping for good genes. Well, we go back to the Neotropics. There are just as good examples in the Neotropics. Here's one of my favorite from Peru, the Andean cock of the rock, which also displays on leks with this fantastic orange-red plumage and these beautiful gray wing feathers here. And the key is that these birds feed on fruit. So it's a prey that wants to be eaten. Females can easily raise their young alone on this easy food. And so the males are free to spend all their time not helping with parental care, but just displaying to attract more and more mates. And this arms race, if you like, between males to become more attractive than their rivals is a case of sexual selection for more and more exotic displays. Here's another example from Costa Rica. This is the long-tailed manakin, and this just displays in teams of two, alpha and beta males. It's very extraordinary. They're not related alpha and betas, but they do a cooperative display where one jumps up and its position on the perch is taken by the next one, and they form this sort of cartwheel display, and they call Toledo, Toledo, Toledo for several minutes on end while the little drab female on the right decides whether she likes this display. And if she likes the display, she'll mate, but she only mates with the alpha male. The poor old beta has to sit in a queue and wait his turn, often for several years before he gets a chance to mate. Well, bright coloration isn't only to do with attracting mates, and this is my last example of bright colours, and it occurs in the poison frogs. Again, one of my favourite sights in the Neotropics. There are over 300 species of these, and this painting by my friend Tim Halliday shows some of the astonishing patterns and colours. So this is known as the blue jeans frog, red and blue. Up on the right, there's a fantastic frog, all blue. Some are black and green. This one here, orange, different patterns, stripes, splodges, and so on. One of the biggest surprises about these poison dart frogs is how small they are. Here's one on a thumb. It's not much bigger than your thumbnail. But they pack a deadly poison. And the most poisonous one is the golden poison frog, Philobates terribilis, and terrible it certainly is. There's enough poison in one of these little frogs to kill 7 human beings, or it's been calculated 20,000 mice. And natives Colombia know all about this, and they catch these golden frogs. They're very careful in holding them in a leaf, not touching the skin, and they wipe their arrows on the skin and use these to bring down sloths and monkeys as food. And the poisons are neurotoxins, which results in paralysis. So it's a fantastic poison in order to kill your food. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace knew this was an example of warning coloration, and he wrote, "The reason these frogs and other animals that are distasteful have bright colours is because an outward sign is needed to indicate to its would-be destroyer that its prey was a disgusting morsel." Well, I don't want to leave these frogs before we discuss just very briefly their incredible reproductive behaviour. We're used to frogs laying eggs in a pond in our back gardens and then disappearing and leaving those eggs to hatch into tadpoles and to make their way on their own. But these poison dart frogs have got fantastic parental care. Here's a male attracting a female. The female comes along, there's a little bit of courtship in the leaf litter. And if she likes him, she'll allow him to fertilize her eggs, and she lays a very small clutch. And the male will then guard and keep the eggs moist by peeing on the eggs to make sure they don't dry out. And then when the eggs hatch in a week or so, the male collects the tadpoles up on his back, perhaps just a few at a time, and he takes them to little streams or pools where they can complete their development. And some species, the male will take the whole brood at once and deposit them in a large pool and just leave them to get on with it. In a large pool or a large stream, there's lots of food, and so the tadpoles can feed themselves. Other species, like the strawberry poison frog, exploits tiny little pools. And the advantage here is that the tadpoles are going to be safer from predators, but the trouble is the little pool's unlikely to have any food. And so what the female does, and this is her Latin name oophagia, which hints at what happens next, is she keeps returning every few days to feed her tadpoles on trophic eggs. These are unfertilized eggs. So she's feeding her tadpoles by giving them eggs to eat. And metamorphosis might take 40 to 50 days, and the tadpoles are fed every 4 days, and it's been calculated that each tadpole needs between 20 and 50 trophic eggs in order to get through to metamorphosis. Well, a sad note, perhaps, to end the talk, there's something like 6,000 frog species in the world. No fewer than a third of them are in danger of extinction. In fact, in the last 20 years, 170 species have gone extinct. And there are many reasons: water pollution, habitat loss, alien introductions, and especially disease, hot topic today because of our own concerns, of course. There's a little fungus disease which is wiping out populations of frogs. And here's a particularly sad example from Costa Rica. This is the golden toad, which used to occur in just one little reserve, Monteverde in Costa Rica. 1987, it was estimated there were about 1,000. 1988, just one. Just one the next year, none the following year. And since then, there have been no records. It's presumably extinct. The only memory is in this lovely drawing, for example, by Tim Halliday, the female here being courted by 4 males. Darwin concludes his Origin of Species by saying there's a grandeur in this view of life, this evolutionary view. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I want to end not with Darwin, but with Darwin's granddaughter, Gwen Raverat. Many of you will know her charming childhood memoir called Period Piece, published in 1952, where she has fond memories shown through her illustrations of the eccentric Darwin family. Here on the top left is Aunt Etty, Henrietta, one of Darwin's daughters, who has got here her patent anti-cold mask. Not so silly these days. She'd have done well during the last year and a half. And here's her husband, Uncle Richard, perhaps even more of a hypochondriac. He insisted on being covered by a blanket whenever the maids opened the windows in order to give the room an airing to avoid catching a chill. Well, Gwen Raverat never met her grandfather. Darwin had died a couple of years before she was born in 1885, but she remembered fond visits to Down House in Kent, where Charles and Emma, his wife, used to live. And here is Gwen as a young girl playing a game of croquet with her mum. And here in the background, surely this is Emma, Charles's wife. Some people in Cambridge still remember Gwen Ravarath being pushed in an old bath chair around town by her nurse, with her dog Sancho following faithfully behind. I want to end with a lovely thought of some handshakes. These people who remember Gwen were just one handshake away from Gwen, who was one handshake away via Emma to Charles Darwin. So they were just 3 handshakes away from our hero himself. Well, that's it. Thank you all very much for listening.
Nick, thank you so much for another absolutely fascinating talk, which I'm sure has resonated with everyone. I was reminded of my first job after I left university was on the plains of Venezuela, and in the trees around our house, we had a troop of red howlers. And the racket, no one told me they were there. My first night, I tried to go to sleep, and the racket they made, absolutely incredible. And then I was going to ask you a question about the evolution and how long it would take to evolve the Davies nostril hummingbird if you made sure to put something attractive up your nose on a regular basis.
I think it's the biggest compliment I've ever had in my life.
Now, we've got several questions for you, and I think we've got about, well, 5 or 10 minutes left, if you don't mind. Firstly, Deborah asked me to ask you, is climate change driving species adaptation in a way that's measurable? And if so, how do you separate the climate change effect from other factors?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I'm not an expert on this myself, but absolutely climate change is having a profound effect on animal distributions to start off with. So I've got colleagues who are documenting distributions of birds in South America, and many species are moving their distribution higher up the Andes in response to climate change, following their envelope of temperature, if you like, their habitats and their food supplies. And many species are spreading north, they're going to run out of habitat, so that's one of the worries. And in response to climate change, just to give you some examples from birds, many birds are changing their migration habits. So perhaps many of you will notice blackcaps, this little warbler, in your back gardens in the winter. And the old idea was these blackcaps are now staying on because of the mild winters. But actually the blackcaps we get in winter have come from Germany. And they're German blackcaps who go west in the winter, in the autumn, instead of south to North Africa. And this westerly route takes them to the milder climate of the UK, where they can feed on berries and so on, and enables them to get back to their breeding quarters quicker because they've got a shorter journey. And experiments using blackcaps in cages have shown that their navigation system takes them by instinct, if you like, reading the stars, west in the autumn instead of south. So this is an evolutionary change in migration direction directly because of climate change and change in resources available. And these sorts of changes, I think, are occurring all the time.
Thanks, Nick. The other question, a quick one, I wanted this one too. Alan asks, what stops the minor worker ant having eggs laid on it?
That's a fantastic question. We've all got fleas, and you imagine a chain of smaller fleas. I don't know the answer to that. What the books say is that the parasites don't bother laying on the minor workers because their bodies are too small for the larvae to develop. But the question you're raising, well, why haven't smaller parasitic flies evolved to exploit smaller body sizes of these minor workers? And that's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
And then there's one from Tom in the chat. This might be a whole lecture on its own, but I'll put it to you because I'm sure there are a few things you can pick out. He asked, what were the differences in style or approach between Wallace and Darwin as naturalists? Anything you would particularly pick out? I mean, I would have said Wallace's prose was probably up there, but I'm sure you'll...
Yes. I think they were rather similar. They were both fantastic observers, and And Darwin especially said that he didn't think he was especially bright, but he was very persistent at noticing things that didn't fit his theory. And he would worry and worry and worry until it fitted, or he got the theory right. So he'd worry about exceptions. He wouldn't sweep them under the carpet. Wallace also was a great observer. Wallace went sort of, I was going to say potty, that's really unfair, but in his old age, he was keen on the seances and all sorts of odd things. So and many geniuses are like this. They're happy to entertain the wildest ideas. And of course, many of those wild ideas turned out to be correct, but some of them turned out to be wrong. So I think being willing to think outside the box is a trait. And then Ed, as you've mentioned, they both write beautifully. And if any of you out there have not read Wallace's Malay Archipelago, do read it. It is just fantastic. For example, there are 2 pages eulogizing about how wonderful bamboo is as a material. And I think these 2 pages are more or less 1 paragraph, but it's just so beautifully written. And they both love the natural world and have this humility. They don't mind being wrong. I think that, yeah, they're both absolute heroes.
Yeah,
they're fantastic. And it's amazing that their writings and ideas are still inspiring us today. We often go back to Darwin and Wallace to ask, well, what did they think about bright colours and displays? Yeah.
Yeah, I must say, I found Wallace wrote My Life, didn't he? A little sort of short little autobiography, and it's just fantastic. You can read it on the internet, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should also say they were very brave. I mean, Wallace really, he got very ill. I mean, he almost died several times from disease and things. There's no self-pity. He just mentions in his diary that he was ill for a month, so he couldn't write much. And then he's back in action. And they don't moan. They work very hard.
Yes, I mean, I've seen some of the cataracts on the upper Amazon that he navigated in his trips up there. How he navigated them, I can't think. Yeah. Anyway, Nick, I think we'll stop there. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I look forward to one day, well, either being with you in Peru or being on a trip somewhere else where you can bring the world around us to life as you have this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.